So welcome to our colleagues to our online learning series. We are looking at career transition, and particularly today we are going to build an effective motivation letter. As usual with us, we have our guru on career transition, our resource person, Rosie. Rosie is the head of career planning and in the career management section with UNHCR. Very pleased to be here with you today. As you know, this is our second last webinar on career transition. There will be one more in a month's time. Thank you for your attendance and your participation. Rosie, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you. So as Marcia said, this is part of a 5 webinar series. We've already been through, of course, session 1 and 2, which was more around understanding what it is that you want to do. And then the last 3 sessions are more around, okay, how do I get this? We've already covered through a couple of sessions the CV. Today we're going to be focusing on motivation letters, and next month it'll be on how to prepare for interviews. So I always like to kick off these sessions with a little bit about us and what the program is, and now a little bit about you. I don't know if you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It was done in 1943, so quite a long time ago now. But it's still, although it's new models of how to assess people's motivation has now evolved. It still stands for me as a very good model for gauging, where you start. Which point, what's driving your motivation to apply for jobs? So I guess the question for you would be, where do you stand in the hierarchy of needs? Are you still very much, actually, I need a job, I need safety and security. Hopefully maybe you're beyond that, and actually you're much more into looking for your next opportunity, so that you're sort of part of some kind of organization which supports you, which enables you to start developing yourself, develop your achievements, to be respected, to have some sort of reputation. Or maybe there's a small percentage of you that have actually reached self-actualization. I remember when I first heard about this model, I was 17 years old, I was studying business. I really thought, actually, I'm sure that's something that very few people reach, and probably after a very long and enriching life. So I guess my question to you would be, where do you feel, given that this session is about motivation and how to express your motivation in writing, where do you stand right now, just as a point of reflection? Are you within the basic needs, I need a job, and actually I don't mind what it is, so long as I get a job? Is it within, no, I can already start, contributing with my skills, my knowledge, etc.? Or is it, I'm looking for something beyond those things, into something much more, about fulfillment?
Colleagues, if you can look at the pyramid and perhaps write down in the chat box where you think you are at this point in your life, in your career, in your professional development. Colleagues, can you hear me? I'm not. Okay, so thank you, Juliana. Juliana, she says that right now she thinks she's very close to self-esteem level. Let's see if other colleagues want to contribute as well. Okay, many talking about self-esteem, some about psychological needs. We have Andrea D on self-actualization, one on safety security, and some on basic needs still.
Okay.
But the majority, let's say, on self-esteem.
Fantastic. I mean, I should say that, I mean, they call it the hierarchy of needs, but, you know, one need is not necessarily a higher need than another. I would say, I mean, I certainly, with the people of concern that we work with, you know, it's more than valid that you should want something purely basic, such as shelter, water, and food, and certainly safety and security. So there's no, I guess, value added to the fact that you might be higher up in the hierarchy than below. But I think often when we look at motivation letters, what's clear is that you're not quite sure why these people are applying. You know, they're very good at describing what they can necessarily, you know, offer, but not sometimes very good at describing why it is that they actually want this opportunity. And it's called motivation letter for a reason. So, you know, that's just as a starting point of reflection. I think it's very important to really understand, you know, what specifically am I trying to achieve with getting this job? And then later I'll explain why it's important for organizations. So welcome to this session. I guess another starting point would be to really understand your objectives. What is it that's brought you to this session? You know, are there any specific objectives you would like to achieve? I'll write these down and make sure that they're covered during the presentation. So what is it that you're particularly worried about when it comes to writing motivation letters?
So I've asked colleagues also in writing in the chat box your objectives for this session, and in particular, what are your needs, what are your maybe concerns when writing motivation letters. So in terms of objective, Paul is saying that the motivation letter is to sell himself. Natalia, on the other hand, is trying to understand why motivation letters are important. Alberto wants to improve the effectiveness of this jobs application. Do's and don'ts in the application in the motivation letter process. How to stand out of the crowd and catch the attention of the recruitment officers. What kind of words, if there are any buzzwords or any phrases that are more liked than others. Also to be able to bring out what I have and can do. So how to best to do that, as well as perhaps creating a structure. I think we got quite a bit. Mostly is, I think, how to stand out, whether with the structure, with the formats, with the right wording, and how to really create that connection with the person who's reading the letter.
Okay, yeah, great. I've written those down. I'm from the structure or the content of this presentation. I think I'm going to be covering most of them, but in any case, as Marcia said, any questions, just put them in the chat and she'll address them to me, and then hopefully I'll be able to answer them. Sorry, yeah. So, I mean, my objectives essentially is, you know, we do a UNHCR, and then in my past career, have been doing a lot of screening on behalf of candidates, etc. And often when I see the text that they've written, I realize that actually a lot of the time they haven't first understood what's the purpose. Natalia, you asked about the importance of the process, so I'll show you why it is actually an important document in this package, the application package. Structure, somebody mentioned that they want to get an understanding of how to structure, and then the what works is definitely there. Somebody mentioned do's and don'ts, and that's definitely part of the presentation as well. So I should be able to cover everybody, but as I mentioned, if you do have any questions, please go ahead and Marcia will address them to me. So let's go to the basics first. What do you think is the purpose of, you know, I mentioned that sometimes when I read these things, I realize that people haven't quite understood what the purpose is. What do you think is the purpose of this document? Again, if you'd like to use the chat.
Yes. I've written down the question in the chat box. If you can, brainstorm with us on what you think is the purpose of the motivation letter. So Siva is saying conveying information. Alberto, make the candidature more sexy. Sell yourself to show the recruiters why me and why this job. To explain achievements. To convince the recruiters that you are the best fit. To introduce yourself and to show additional information than in the CV. Linking the skills that are already contained in the CV to perhaps more softer skills, so passion for the job you're applying to. To filter candidates, to convince the hiring managers that you know the job you're applying for, to match the skill and requirement to the position you're applying. Mostly it's about showing that you're the good candidate, showing your experience. Nora is saying first entry point for hiring managers to consider you for the next stage. And some are talking about making sure that you are the right fit for the position.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all of those things are very valid and they're absolutely right. But often in this process, we confuse the means with the end. And what do I mean by that? The only purpose of a motivation letter is to get you to the next stage. And so this is about management of information. What is it? What information do I need to put there that makes sure that I'm a candidate that goes to the next stage? And the next stage is usually an interview. In some cases, it might not be. In our internal processes, for example, here at UNHCR, it might actually just already mean directly that you're the selected candidate. But the only purpose of this document is to get you selected to the next stage. And the means for doing it is, yes, position yourself as the right candidate, making sure that whatever you're talking about is relevant to what they're looking for, all the things that you've mentioned. And why do I say this? Because you have one page. You don't have 10 pages to write your whole life story. And so the whole purpose of this document is, I like to call it an aperitif. It's to open the appetite to say, I want to know more. I want to meet this person. So it means that you need to limit the information to, you want to whet their appetite to bite-sized pieces of information that are interesting enough so that they say, actually, I really, this is really interesting. I'd love to be able to go into more detail about that during an interview. And this is important because it needs to be short, it needs to be punchy, it needs to be to the point. So when you're talking about all those things that you need to do, etc., always keep in mind that this is about management of information. What is it specifically that they need to know about me at this stage, without overwhelming them with everything else that I could talk about, which might actually bring down the quality of your message. Okay, so that's the first point that I wanted to make. Always think in terms of aperitivo, aperitif, appetizer in English. Always think in terms of these bite-sized pieces of information that are going to really whet the appetite for thinking, I really want to meet this person.
And there is a comment in which one of the colleagues is saying, but if they reach the motivation letter, it means that already your CV is good for the job, or you met at least a minimum requirement. Is there a time constraint, the motivation letter? Does it come before or after the CV when a recruiter looks at it?
Yeah, I'll be talking about that because it's I've interviewed a lot of recruiters about this because I'm always very interested. What is it that they read first? Is it the CV? Is it the motivation letter? And actually, it depends who you talk to. I've spoken to recruiters that the first thing they do is read the motivation letter because it's a way of, out of everything that I could read on the CV, they're already highlighting what I need to know. And then you have the opposite, people that say, no, I want to see what their background is. If it's relevant enough, I'll go into this in a few slides. If it's relevant enough, then I'll read the motivation letter. But if it's not relevant at all, I'm not going to waste my time. So it kind of depends. But I mean, as people said, it is an opportunity to express motivation and interest. It's an opportunity to highlight why you are the candidate that is good for that position. It's an opportunity to explain something that might not be reflected on your CV, and this is especially important for people that are looking to transition into things that they haven't done before. And that's, of course, also a way of standing out, because well-written pieces are rare. And a way of standing out is just making sure that something is well-written. Now, the other thing that I see when I'm looking at motivation letters is that there's a bit of confusion of what should be, and in the end, in an application, you have these two elements. You have the CV on the one hand, and then you have the letter on the other hand. So what should be, you know, given that you've got these two opportunities to sell your skills and your experience, what is it that should really go into each of them? So CV is very much about what. I mean, to a certain extent, if you build your bullet points well, you can also say how. And what impact that had. But the letter, of course, since it's text, gives you much more of an opportunity to explain why. So what is it that I'm interested in, my motivation, and above all, what impact you have, because it's much more difficult to express that on a CV. So given that, you have one page maximum to write all this out, always think about, okay, specifically, what's already in my CV? And if it's there, what's the point? You know, other than highlighting the most important things, there's no point in repeating everything that's on your CV. And that's often what you see in motivation letters, that you have somebody saying, oh, I started my career in this place, and then I went to that place, and then I did this. That's already on your CV, so you don't need to talk about that. What you need to do is to highlight, you know, 3 things that are of importance to the organization that you're applying to. So, again, one question that I always get when I'm delivering these sessions is, you know, do they really read it? So it goes back to the comment that one of the colleagues made. And basically, it depends. You know, here you have a graph that more or less expresses to what extent they might read it or not. I mean, I have met recruiters that read every single one, but of course, it depends on your workload. I think when you've got a very, very high workload, you start becoming more efficient. And as I mentioned, you might look at the CV, and if it's relevant or more or less relevant, then you'll. So what is it that it depends on? It depends very much on fit. It depends on volume. So the more volume, the less likely they are to be read. And then in terms of the UN system, simply there's less applicants at higher grades because not all of us have got up there. So the higher the grade and also the stakes are much higher, then the more likely they are to be read as well. Because, you know, it's really important that you hire, a manager can destroy a whole operation, whereas a single person can do some damage but not destroy the whole operation. So it depends to what, certainly if you don't fit at all or you fit 100% in terms of your CV, and this is, you know, in those cases where they read the CV first, it's less likely to be read. But to what extent this document that you spent so many hours, you know, trying to perfect, etc., is read also depends on these 3 factors. And fit, I've already mentioned, the volume, and then of course to do with the same thing, the grade, which is less volume, but then also because the stakes are much higher. Somebody asked about whether it's important or not, and I do think it's especially important in one case. I mean, if you fit 100%, as I mentioned, you know, you fit, and they might read it out of interest. Okay, they fit, and then on top of that, they've written a good motivation letter. But when it can really be important is when you're not 100. I mean, few of us fit 100% to what we're applying to. So it's actually the motivation letter that is going to help the recruiter decide, do they go in the interview pile or don't they? So it is a very important document. Sometimes I've seen motivation letters which are really badly written. I mean, for example, if drafting skills are part of the job description and you write a bad motivation letter, then that's it, you're out. So it is actually a very important part of the application process. Now, what is true is that the first barrier, which is usually human resources, are much more likely to read it, not always, but are much more likely to read it than busy managers. Managers, as we talked about in the first, the CV webinar, they tend to be very busy, they're to the point, etc. So they'll take decisions much more quickly based on, does this person have the background that I'm looking for, yes or no? Although, as I say, I have read comments, for example, in our system, we can read the comments that managers put on each candidate, and you can see very clearly that they have really read the motivation letter. And in the case of one client, for example, that I was looking to see what was happening with his applications, he was dismissed because he put the wrong operation in the motivation letter that he was applying to. So clearly he was writing the same motivation letter to the different, and so just that fact, it was like, look, is this guy motivated? He's not even changing, instead of South Sudan, he was applying to, Pakistan or something. So it is, I think, it's one of these things that you can't afford to be not good at this. Because today I had a meeting with the talent outreach and acquisition section, and they were telling me, we're looking for excuses to fill. We've got too many candidates. 30,000 people applied to our different job postings last year. We're looking for excuses to filter people out, and certainly a badly written, we call it letter of interest now, is one of the factors. So it is important that whatever you do it well. So that's a little bit on the basics, and now I'll go into how to build an effective motivation letter. So I mentioned right at the beginning that that we often confuse the means with the end. The only objective is to get you the interview. So what should it include? Well, it's called a motivation letter for something. So the fact that you're motivated, and why is it that you're motivated? Why you fit. And if you are looking to make a functional change, what kind of skills are you transferring to this new position? So we were talking about structure, and this is I would say the best structure, which is to start. Your first paragraph should be focused on the role that you're applying to, or the organization that you're applying to. So you basically start with them, and I'll go into why that's important. The main part of your motivation letter has to be then, why me? And then finally, the last part of the motivation letter should be focused on, okay, what's the next step? My guru, so Marcia said that I was a guru. I don't think I am. My guru, I think, is a guru. And he always says, just think about you, me, we. That's the best way of always remembering how to structure a motivation letter. So I focus on you first, then I'm going to focus on me. And then after that, we'll focus on the two of us together. And he used to call it, let's get married. So a very easy way of remembering what that structure has to be is, you, me, we. Okay? Now, this is just to give you an understanding that now some organizations no longer have one field, which is a motivation letter. Some UN agencies have gone towards asking some questions, which in the end is exactly the same content as what would go into a regular motivation letter. But just so that you're prepared for that, because this is our new letter of interest, and where we have 3 questions. Which is the first question is around achievements and experience. How does that fit what you're applying to? The second is much more around skills and competencies. And then the third is around, what is it that makes this position interesting to you? So in the end, if you go back, it's the same. The first paragraph would be the third question, and the body is the first 2 questions. And I know other UN agencies have something similar. The reason why we moved towards this structure was because we found that motivation letters didn't always tell us what we needed to hear. And so we felt that by giving some very specific questions, we would get what we need. And definitely, I have seen that there's an improvement because it's also character limited. So it means that, in the past, people might have sent you 3, I've even seen 4-page motivation letters, which are impossible to read. And this necessarily limits you to put the most essential information in the system. Now, if I asked you why is starting with them important, what would you say? Why do you think it's important that you should start with them?
So colleagues, as usual, use the chat box. So when drafting a motivation letter, why is starting with the organization an important step?
Yeah, or the role, it can be also. Why is it this particular role is so interesting to you?
Okay, so some answers are coming in. It shows you know what you're applying for. It shows that the line of interest is also the same, or that is part of my professional development. Again, it demonstrates that I've read the TOR, explains again your direct line of interest, and also shows your understanding of the organization and the role.
Yeah, absolutely. All those things, yeah, completely valid, because it does show already that you've done some research, that you've made an effort to really understand what it is that they're looking for. But there's also an element of emotional intelligence. And I like this cartoon very much. You know, how rude of me. I've been talking about myself all night and I haven't even given you a chance to talk about me. You know, and they always talk about this process of job hunting almost like a dating process. You know, and if you just basically meet somebody and all they're doing is talking about themselves, the person that's listening, you know, you might be a fascinating person, but at some point you might think, you know, what about me? You know, so it's also about emotional intelligence. And I'll show you some samples now of first paragraphs, and they immediately make the recruiter sit up and think, actually, you know, this person that is motivated by what I do, clearly has done their research, and that's also a very tangible way of showing motivation. So it's a combination of aligning, as somebody said, your interest with theirs, but above all, it's also a way of very quickly engaging your audience. You know, if you focus on the other person first, you're showing, you know, interest, you're showing through that interest motivation, and so it makes the reading of the rest of the motivation letter a lot more engaging. I mean, journalists are taught that in the first paragraph of any article that they write, you need to have a grabber. And so, you know, these first paragraphs are a real form of, you know, literally capturing the attention. So you think, gosh, how interesting. And then it makes them much more open to read the rest of the information that's in your motivation letter. And the other reason why it's really, really important is because in the end, all organizations, they're not just looking for talent, they're looking for top talent. And it's known that top talent is a combination of two things. It's not just having the skills and the experience, which kind of demonstrates why you're qualified, but it's also people that are driven by what they do. Because motivated people are statistically 21% more productive than people that aren't. So organizations are not only looking for, do they have the background, do they have the skills, etc., but they're also looking for people that are motivated, because they know that work is tough. So we need resilient people, and we need people that are, you know, willing to, because they're motivated, to overcome all those challenges. So if you look at this graph, I think this was developed by McKinsey, one of the consulting firms, in terms of, you know, how they're viewing candidates. You know, you might have all the skills but low drive, so you're in the wrong role. You might have all the drive but no skills, so it's somebody who tries hard but, you know, not necessarily somebody that they're going to be interested in. The ones that they're really going for are these high performers that have both this combination of experience and skills but are also extremely motivated. So first step, work out why you're applying. And I have found in a lot of letters that I read that people find it very difficult to articulate why it is that they're applying. So they come up with something very standard, and you know, they haven't really sat down and thought, actually, you know, you're going to be spending a minimum of 8 hours, usually 10 hours a day in that job. You know, what is it particularly that motivates you about that role? And it's, I think, particularly important in the humanitarian sector. Because we are mission-driven organizations where motivation is actually, of course, the skills are really important because we need the right people to do the jobs that we do, but you're also looking for that kind of motivation. So but motivation is different for different people. So you could be motivated by different things. You just have to come up with something which you know is important to you, that you feel might be important to them. And so what could that be? It could be the mission of the organization. It could be the role. You know, I've met people that just love I don't know, data management. You think, well, how can they like that? No, they really like. I actually work with one of them. You know, that they actually really enjoy the daily tasks, or maybe it's the environment. You know, that they actually like being in this type of environment. It could be being, you know, on the front line of humanitarian delivery. It could be the fact that it's super international, or that it's fast moving, or that you're working with top people, or whatever it is. So just think about, when you are applying to these organizations, it's important for you, I think, because ultimately you're going to be working there, as I mentioned, many hours a day. But it's also really important, and this is when we're talking about people standing out. I think this is a way of standing out. So I'm going to give you three examples that I've seen that I think are actually quite good at expressing that motivation.
So can you all see the screen? You can read it for yourself. If you cannot, just let me know and I will read it for you.
So that's one example. I hope everybody's had time to read it.
Yeah, there is no comments. Oh, there are actually comments on which paragraph of the letter this is.
This is the first paragraph.
So it's the first letter to the letter. So Josephine is asking, there is no, I would hereby like to apply to the position of, I don't know, program officer with the energy consulting, or there is no standard. Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
This is example number 2.
Okay, and then this is the third example. So I've chosen these 3 examples. I mean, I could show you many more, but I think it just reflects, you're basically engaging the reader emotionally. And somebody who's very who's working in the organization, very motivated by what they do, if they see that you're equally motivated, then it invites the reader to read the main part of the motivation letter, which is, why me? So they're quite different. So one is more in health, one is in energy, and another one is in human rights. But I hope I can, by these 3 examples, show you what I mean. And this kind of model, you can apply it to a private sector. It doesn't matter. I think if you can relate the mission of the organization or the role, because it's something that you really like to do, with what it is that you can contribute, that's already a very good way of writing that first paragraph.
And Rosie, somebody was asking whether in particular the second one, isn't it too informal, or is a kind of an informal language also okay for a motivation letter?
I mean, I think the world is becoming if you were applying to, let me think, Goldman Sachs, the bank, or something like that, maybe, being formal is something which is very important. I mean, like all communication, you need to adapt to your audience. So you would know what is more correct. Having done your research, you understand what the organization is like. Hopefully, you might even know a couple of people that work there. So you know to what extent an organization is super formal or isn't formal. Now, generally speaking, I mean, I wouldn't say that any of these three are particularly informal. Personally, I wouldn't think that. But it is true that if you are applying to something extremely formal, then you just have to tweak things so that the style is also good. So yes, I mean that brings up a very good point, that it is important to to align whatever style that you're writing with the style of the organization. And this is especially important in today's world where young people are becoming less and less formal. I think good writing is good writing regardless. That there's no, in my view, there shouldn't be any concession on that. But I think it's something that, so in terms of style, something that's well written will do well without it necessarily being, super formal.
And is there any difference, you reckon, between, for example, applying for UN mission, humanitarian agency, or UN agencies?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I know the colleagues in TOAS that are doing the screening. They're people that are very committed to what we do, etc. But they wouldn't expect me referred to as if they were the High Commissioner, in a government meeting. They would expect, they just want to understand, okay, why is it you're motivated by this? And the same with our managers. I don't think that they're expecting that they should be treated like sort of, royalty or something like that. No, so I think, what I put here as 3 examples, I think they're absolutely fine.
And one more question, what's the difference between a cover letter and motivation letter? And again, talking about formality and the kind of language and how to tweak it to the right audience.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the difference between a motivation letter and a cover letter, there's no difference at all. I think one is more used in the US and one is more used in UK, but it's essentially exactly the same thing. So it's just a different way of calling it. Motivation letters are more direct in what they're trying to achieve, I guess. But in terms of the content and everything, it's the same. It's just, it was, originally a letter that accompanies the CV that I'm sending you to be able to add to whatever it is that I'm sending you on my CV. So there's no difference at all. And in terms of style, I would look at, for example, the website of the organization. Recently I've been dealing with, it's an online scheduling system for organizing our, career counseling, etc. These guys, I don't know where they are. It might be in Palo Alto, somewhere in California or something. They're super informal. Very personable, very, very informal in the way that they express themselves, the things that they put on their website, etc. And that already gives an indication that if you were super formal, they'd think, woof, what's wrong with this person? We want somebody that's more fun and more like us. So I think if you just look at the way that the website is written, etc., that should already be able to give you an indication of the kind of style that you should be using in terms of your writing.
And in terms of concisiveness then, because some application forms, they only allow you, I don't know, for example, 1,300 characters, Katia is asking. So what can I put in with 1,300 characters? It cannot be very flowery language anyway.
Yeah, again, you have to look at what the system allows, and then based on that, you'll have to be more direct or less direct. At the moment, I'm doing an effective writing course. And the one thing that I'm learning in that course is that we often use a lot of extra words that don't necessarily add to the text, and that you do it somehow to make it feel as if it's more solid or something like that. But sometimes you don't actually need to use all these extra words. So depending on the character limitation, you might have to get rid of all those extra words and just keep to the essential. So it's something which is very direct and very clean.
Thank you. One more question, and I don't know if you're going to touch upon it later on, is should the motivation letter be limited? Should the motivation letter relate to the CV? And if so, which part of the CV or not at all?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it should relate to the CV in the sense that, I mean, some people, as I mentioned, giving you a blow by blow what's happening on their CV, and that's a wasted opportunity, because a motivation letter can describe much more in depth how it is that you do things and what impact that had. Now, that said, saying, as my CV demonstrates, I have a 7 years solid experience in the supply function. But you don't need to refer to the CV, as I mentioned, in terms of just repeating what's on your CV, because you're just wasting the opportunity of what this document can do for you. So I mean, I'll show you with when it comes to the second part of the motivation letter, a little bit, how you can, I mean, of course, you're not going to have a different background on your motivation letter to what's on your CV, but again, it's not a matter of repetition, it's a matter of highlighting and going into more depth. Now, the second step, there is a tendency, especially when we're in job hunting mode, to say, okay, I'm going to write one motivation letter, and then basically that's going to be my motivation letter that regardless of what it is that I'm applying to, I'm going to send the same thing, to the point, as I mentioned, of this manager saying, this person is applying to my operation, which is in South Sudan, and he's talking about the operation in Pakistan. And this happens a lot. I mean, I used to work, in a sector, so with recruiting recruiters from the healthcare sector, and they were always telling me, no, look, your students are sending us a letter, which I'm in Johnson & Johnson, and they're applying to Lilly, or they're applying to Roche, or to Novartis, or whatever, no? And this happened constantly, and for them, it puts them off, because it doesn't make you feel special. Oh, they're applying. I mean, they know you're applying to the, if you're in job hunting mode, you're going to be applying to their organizations, but you don't have to rub their nose into it. In the end, this is about, expressing your motivation for that organization. So really important that you actually tailor this document to what it is of the organization, like your CV. Tailor it to specifically what they're looking for, because again, this is information management. This is like what I need to tell them to make sure that I get to the next stage. So do review the job description. At UNHCR, we also have operational context, because we have standard job descriptions, but then of course the operation in Uganda might be very different from what's happening in Costa Rica or in Venezuela or in Myanmar. So we have the two things, and those contexts require specific skills, so you need to address whatever it is that they're looking for. Now, if the information is scant, and some organizations are terrible about putting details about what they're looking for, again, motivation, do your research. See if you can find through your network people that are working there that could give you a good understanding of what specifically is required in that context. So do the extra work of finding out exactly what it is that they're looking for, because we're talking about standing out. Well, standing out is really addressing the needs of that particular job role. And because this issue of relevance is super important. And again, as you see, I like cartoons. Your resume states that you work with two presidents, won the Nobel Prize, and you've also climbed Mount Everest. That's fantastic, but how are you at telemarketing? So it's really important that you always keep in mind that whatever it is that you send is 100% relevant to what they're looking for. And that might sound obvious, but again, seeing what I see, it doesn't seem to be that obvious, because some people really don't address the needs of the role. So how do you do it? This is an example of a logistics officer. Of course, you can't put everything that might be in one of these job descriptions. I looked it up on the UN Careers site. So it gives you, on the one hand, the functional statement, what are the responsibilities, what competencies they're looking for, and then what experience they're also looking for. So I think it's important to print these things out and then think, okay, out of everything that they're asking, what are the most important things that they're looking for? Because I'm going to have to, I can't tell them, I've got one page, so I can't tell them everything, but what is it that's really important to them? So always, as I say, print it out, get yourself a highlighting pen and say, okay, they're looking for this, they're looking for that. What would, and if you're already fulfilling that function, you would know, actually, out of all the things, some things are really, really important, the must-haves. Other things, it's like the nice-to-have, but if I don't have it, it's not going to kill me. So what are the must-haves? Because that's how you focus the relevance of what you're going to be writing. Because in the end, this is a matter of basically matching. What in this case it would be UNHCR is looking for. We have a mandate to fulfill, and we're looking for certain profiles to fulfill that mandate. So we need certain knowledge or experience. We need competencies. We're looking for motivation, but we're also thinking of, do they have the background, because we have to build our pipeline for management. And then on the other side, of course, there's the candidate who has their expertise and their experience. They've also got their competencies, their interests, and of course they're looking for career development. So I mean, essentially, in terms of choosing what needs to go in that motivation letter, is like, out of all those things, you need to choose 3 reasons. So what are the top 3 reasons why I should be the person that's the right candidate for this position? And what's really important is not just saying, look, these are the reasons, but you need to tell, you need to show them. So whatever it is that you put there, you need to support it by evidence. The people saying that I have great leadership skills, you think, great, so do I. How do I know? So it's really important that you actually express things in terms of showing that you've got these things rather than just telling, which is very, very typical of most motivation letters. So what do I mean by this? Again, you can really, the same structure that I suggested for building your bullet points on a CV, you can also use this for building your paragraphs in a motivation letter. So think about a particular challenge or maybe a situation you were confronted with. Again, out of your whole CV, what it is that I'm going to highlight that's going to show a specific action that I did that is going to show the skills and experience that I have, and then what was the result. So this little framework, I think, really helps people understand how to build those paragraphs. So here's an example.
Again, if you cannot read it, just let me know.
So as you see here, then they're referring to the CV, so rather than sort of saying, first I started working here, and then I started working there, and then I started working there, they're just summarizing. Basically, I have solid 7 years experience, the last 4 of which have been in UN operations, and then going into specific examples of their experience that show that they have. If we go back to what they're looking for. That they have the manages logistics operations. It has all the different elements that are part of this job description are there. But it doesn't just say I'm a great logistics manager. That it's actually supported by evidence, because it's giving context to where they've worked, and it's also giving a result at the end. That thanks to all this job, we were all able to deliver the goods in a timely manner. So this is what I mean about showing rather than just telling. And because you're contextualizing it, you're the only person that's done that. So it makes it much more personal. It makes you stand out as a candidate, because it gives you personality rather than, if you're a logistics officer and just describe purely what you've done, all logistics officers are very likely to have done exactly the same thing, but they won't have done it in an emergency situation. They won't have done it in South Sudan or Bangladesh, and maybe they're not mentioning the things that you're mentioning. So really important that you always put things in terms of showing rather than just telling. And if you can put this result at the end, again, just psychologically think about the reader, and it's not just I've done these things, but actually thanks to these things, there's been impact. The people of concern have received what they need in an accurate and timely manner.
And Rosie, what about the use of bullet points in the motivation letter?
I've seen the use of bullet points. For example, somebody describing a very big project, and then in bullet points specifying what were the key things in that project management that are important and relevant to what it is that they're applying to. I mean, I would say there are no set rules around this. I think things need to be, I'll show you later, the importance of formatting is really, really important because it makes things much more readable, etc. But don't confuse a motivation letter with a CV, which is your bullet points or your key achievements, etc. I mean, you could put, for example, a key achievement, summarizing that key achievement, and then put, delivering on this required communication with stakeholders, and a negotiation with government partners, or things that might be important to effective, negotiation with government partners. I mean, I have nothing against bullet points because I do think that it helps formatting, but don't confuse it with a CV, because a CV is a CV, and that definitely has to be very bullet pointed and very short statements, etc. A letter is more letter format, so I have a preference for well-written paragraphs than necessarily have things all super bullet pointed. So I mean, as I say, it goes either way. I don't say definitely don't do it, because I've seen some very nicely formatted motivation letters, but at the same time ensure that it doesn't become this kind of list of little key achievements, which is more what a CV should look like.
Thank you. And one more on the to match the evidence to the requirements in the TOR. So taking point by point in the essential requirements and then kind of place it back into the motivation letter. So I guess it's rephrasing the CV in a way, but using the TOR.
Yes, I mean, the thing is that you can't put everything. So the issue of this management of information is you're going to have to choose. You can't put everything. So just put what is really going to highlight how you work. What is it that you've done? Because the CV already gives a lot of information, so don't worry, because that information is already there. The issue is to try and sort of humanize, I guess, if you like, put some personality behind the bullet point, maybe go into more depth, and it does give you an opportunity to describe skills more. Skills are a little bit more difficult to describe in a CV than basically standard achievements. So, for example, when they're asking for things like, especially the interpersonal skills, communication or teamwork, etc., it's more difficult to do that on a CV in a couple of lines than it is to actually do it in a paragraph, showing the fact that you really do have these interpersonal skills. So here you have another example.
You can read the other example in the on the screen.
So, I mean, again, when you're choosing what it is that you're going to be focusing on, the previous example was much more based on experience. This paragraph is much more based on, planning and organizing is a core skill for this job. So how do I explain planning and organizing? Now, in the job description that I showed you, it's quite interesting. Because, I mean, the UN has different ways of sometimes they just state these are the competencies we're looking for. In the case of this particular job description, they're actually describing the competency. I mean, these are things that are freely, you can look them up online. Planning and organizing competency, UN system, and you have there all the different behaviors. But I thought this was a very good example because he literally looks at the competency and is going down each of those behaviors. So he's really proving that he's got that. But again, through an example. So she's showing that he's got that. Planning and organize. Yeah.
Sorry. I was saying, what about the use of certain words? So kind of rephrasing, utilizing some keywords that are from the TOR or the job description into the motivation letter.
Well, this is becoming increasingly important in the, I mean, not yet in the UN system because we're really not, we're not there yet. But the world. I've been researching this since our last webinar more and more because we're also looking into it. This concept that it's going to be machines doing the screening and not human beings, and so these keywords are becoming increasingly important. So yes, I would recommend. I mean, in the end. They always have this expression of "in Rome, do as the Romans do." If you think about the language that they use in certain sectors and certain job functions, etc., mirroring that language shows that you're one of them. It's just a way of showing them that yes, you are one of them. So that should be something that you're doing more or less anyway. But I think it is becoming, as you mentioned, it's becoming increasingly important. I mean, now a lot of these artificial intelligence systems for matching candidates, they're using natural language processing, NLP it's called, and they're not only looking at the keywords, but they're also asking the recruiters to come up with words that if they're not using that word, what else could they be using, and it's so that the system becomes more efficient in terms of matching candidates. So hopefully they'll become more and more intelligent so that the match really is there. Because the ones that I've tried out just doing the research, I thought, oof, if this is what it is, for example, I tested it with one client, perfect CV for the position that they were applying to. He just asked me to review it, and I thought, I'd take the opportunity, and I used an organization called JobScan, where I copy-pasted the position he was applying to. I copy-pasted his CV into the system, and the match was 34%. And if I'd been reading it as a recruiter, I would have chosen him for sure because he had the perfect background for it. So the systems, I think it's a good idea to do it, but you should be aware that the systems are not so, we're at the early stages of this, and they're not as efficient as they could be. But certainly, yes, it's a good idea.
Thank you.
So this is, I think, the final example. Again, if you were they're asking for good communication skills. What does that mean? And again, this person could have said, I have great communication skills, but by providing a specific context, an action and a result, I think it becomes much more effective. And especially when it comes to communication, we think it's about, conveying information in a clear and structured manner. Yes, it is, but it's above all about listening. And it's about clarifying. It's about, so communication is not just about, you being able to say things clearly. It's also very much about understanding your audience, adapting to your audience, etc. So I think this is a really good example. By listening to their concerns, clarifying areas of confusion, being clear on what could or could not be done, I managed to advocate and achieve the best environment for service delivery. I think this is a great example. Rather than just saying I have great communication skills or I'm a great team player, you're actually showing that you are. So only after looking at the job description, looking at your own background, deciding what are those 3 key things you're going to say, talk about, and then how you're going to support them, only then would I sit down and write. And why do I say this? Because often when I'm reading these motivation letters, clearly that hasn't been done. So the person's just sitting down and just try to write this thing, and then it becomes really confusing. Again, I'm doing this Writing Effectively course, and it's quite useful in realizing to what extent sitting down, deciding, okay, what are going to be my points? It makes your writing a lot more efficient, rather than using the process of writing to try and clarify what it is that you're going to say. And I really like this quote by Scott Fitzgerald, the American writer, who's actually one of my favorite writers. You don't write because you want to say something, you write because you have something to say. So if you decide what it is that you want to say and then sit down and write, it's going to make your text a lot clearer, and it's going to make your writing a lot less painful and a lot more efficient. So do that exercise first. Look at the job description. 3 key reasons. I'm going to look at my background. How am I going to, evidence this? Okay, I've got and then sit down and write, and then you can perfect how you write it. So we come to the last part of the letter. I like to focus on this last part also because I'm amazed that nowadays, because we're becoming less and less formal in writing, people actually don't close a motivation letter. And they don't even sign off. And this, it's actually really important for the reader. And the parallel that I like to run is, imagine that you're sitting in a cafe with somebody, you've had a really nice chat, and then suddenly they get up and they leave. Yeah, how does that make you feel? You know, there hasn't been, or you're in a meeting and they don't close the meeting. You know, it's like, has this happened? Has it not happened? So it's a really good idea to actually do this closure. So, I mean, and the closure can be really simple, but I think it absolutely needs to be there for an emotional reason. That is, okay, you know, I've spoken about you, I've spoken about myself. Now this last part, which is, you know, what's the next step? What's that going to look like? So it can be really simple, you know. In addition to the above, my CV includes detailed information on the different operations I worked on, and training programs I've attended. Should you need any further information, please do not hesitate to contact me. So that's kind of one example. Another one, you know, I believe the X experience, and it could be whatever it is, experience, competencies described above and in my CV make me a good candidate for the position. Thank you for an attention, and I look forward to hearing about the next step. But it is, as I say, an important part of letters. It's not called a letter for no reason. So it is important to make sure that you always have this structure of you, me, and we. Okay.
Okay, so I think we have, okay, yeah, excellent. We have a few questions on format, but perhaps before we go into that, I have one question on the content from Josephine and Brinda, looking at how they can better convey their experience if they jump back and forth between different positions to demonstrate, for example, one specific competence. So let's say planning and organizing, they have a number of different positions in which they've done that, perhaps at a more junior element. So how can they convey that message better? So Brinda is asking the specific question, should we focus on one thing which we feel is more important, or should we focus on the dynamic nature of the work?
Yeah, no, I would always, I mean, your space is limited, and you have to keep your messages very simple. Generally speaking, I would always try to use examples which are more recent rather than ones that were more earlier on in your career, because the recruiter might question, oh, wait a minute, they did planning and organizing when they graduated from university. What happened, you know, in the next 7 years? You know, they might, I mean, I'm exaggerating it, but just to make a point. So ideally, always start, if you do come with examples, the more recent, the better, simply because what you're doing right now is accumulation of everything that you've learned in the past. Generally speaking, and I'm being very general here, the examples that you'll come up with, you know, towards, you know, what you're doing right now will be fresher in your mind, richer in experience, because you might have more responsibility. And so I think it's more effective to use more recent examples. I mean, your CV will explain your career, your trajectory. So they'll see the dynamic nature, and on your CV they're already seen that maybe you had a bit of planning and organizing in your first role, and then in a second role, and in the third role, etc. So you don't necessarily have to explain, oh, I've done planning and organizing in all these different roles. I think choosing a powerful, more recent example is again, you're thinking of key messages. What do I want them to walk away with? Is more effective than necessarily repeating that I've done planning and organizing, all these different things, because they can already see it on your CV.
Great. So the rest of the questions are on the format, on leaving margins, or start with the most recent experience and follow chronological order, and so on and so forth. So I think we're going to touch up on this now.
Yeah, formatting is really, really important. I mean, content is of course important, but the number of letters that I've seen that have been ruined by poor formatting, or even text. This morning I was looking at something for another presentation that I'm developing, and I found a really interesting article on this. And this person had not not a single paragraph in this whole article. I mean, going all the way down a page. And I thought, I'm not reading this. I mean, it sounded really interesting and it was quite engaging at the beginning, but I thought, well, I'm not reading this. So formatting is really, really important. And this final stage of really making things look good, in Spanish is an expression that, things go in through your eyes, no? And they're usually referring to a plate full of food. Well, this is the same. I mean, Japanese food looks incredibly appetizing because it's always beautifully laid out. Whereas if you have things piled on, it doesn't matter how it's piled on, you literally lose your appetite thinking, oof, I'm not going to eat this. So really important. The formatting is very much part of your brand. How you I mean, it's the same as a good packaging on a product. So it is very much about your brand, and above all, also your attention to detail. So people that they've done all this effort to write their text, etc., but then the text is full of spelling mistakes, or it's not, well, it doesn't look good, etc. You think, well, it gives an impression of shoddy work, which shouldn't be. And I mean, this is an invented text, by the way. I got a motivation letters from some different students. This was a while ago. But if you look at these two texts, just your first impression, which one is more readable? A or B?
Exactly. So A or B, if you can put your answer in the chat box. I'm going to try and count them. Let's see. There is a series of A so far. Nobody's saying B. I don't know if there is a peer pressure or if actually they think it's more readable.
Yeah, clearly it's much more readable. So how you format is going to immediately invite the reader to want to read something or not. And you'll see that in the case of the cover motivation letter on the left, the font is larger. So it should be, I would say it has to be ideally 11 font. 10 I would say is already the limit. Margins here are reasonable, and yes, you see that he's spaced out his paragraphs quite well. Whereas the one on the right is much tinier writing, and I am at the age in which I have to use glasses all the time, and then the formatting is a little bit all over the place, especially that second paragraph. You think, how on earth am I going to read that? So really, really important that you pay attention to the formatting. In English, the different countries have different ways of formatting their letters. In English, your name and your email, your contact details are on the right. And then whoever it is that you're sending the letter to, in application systems, of course, you don't need to do this. Your name goes on the right, and your contact details go on the right, and the person that you're addressing the letter to goes on the left, and the date is always above that. And somebody asked, you're not mentioning what specific role you're applying to. Well, if you use the reference, and this is really, really important, and recruiters, especially in large organizations, say this time and time again, this is if you need to attach something to a process, that it's not something you're copy pasting into, which is increasingly the case, by the way. You're no longer uploading a PDF of your motivation letter. Put the reference in the letter itself, because when they print these things out, they might be dealing with maybe 15 different positions at the same time. They print them out and then they're all in the same printer, and it's difficult to know which is from which. So it really helps them if you actually put the reference of the job role, which could be the ID, the job title, and it just helps them immediately say, okay, they're applying to this position. And then you don't need to add more text in that first paragraph stating, I am writing to apply to the position of blah, 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 that already occupies some kind of space. Okay. And what's also important in, again, in English, and I'm saying this because we have people from different nationalities here in HCR, often if there is a contact name, which increasingly there never is, they tend to put the full name. And in English, it's only, for example, my surname is Innes, it would be Miss Innes, not Miss Roseanne, dear Miss Roseanne Innes, no. But you see that often, no? Or you can use dear sirs, madam, if there's no contact details. So in Spanish, actually, it's the opposite. You know that or you can put also your name and address on the left-hand side as well. It's different.
And in terms of using, for example, italics, let's say to mention a title or report, or would it be too confusing, or is it okay?
No, you can use it. I mean, the recruiters, interestingly, when I've asked them about this, they say, look, the more neutral, the better, because when you have things which are just full of italics or full of of bold, for example, and that it can be a bit distracting. I mean, the jury is a little bit out on that. That actually, you know, often they're scanning these letters. So if there's a sort of key thing that you want to highlight, putting that in either italics or bold might be a good way of when they're scanning the motivation letter, that they you know, they get the key points that you're trying to convey. But what they do tell me is just sometimes you get these motivation letters that everything seems to be bold, and then you can't work out what the other text is. So moderation in that, I would say, that use it, you know, moderately.
Thank you.
So part of the pack that I'll be sending, again, it's just like the CV. You know, we've got this kind of, you know, checklist in terms of when you're having to review your. I think it's a good idea once you've written it to give it to somebody else that can just give you an objective point of view. You know, is this well written? Is it clear, etc. But if you don't have that, then you can also use this as a kind of prompt to see whether the motivation letter is at number 4 excellent in all counts, or whether there's something that maybe you could improve on.
One question, yeah, on handwritten motivation letters. What's your take on it?
What's my take on it? I think it would depend on who you're applying to. If it was human resources, I'd say no.
But let's say that the company asks for it.
Well, some countries like France, for example, they're very into graphology, and they use, you know, it's part of their. I mean, I find it absurd, frankly, and it's actually very contested. But they do use handwriting samples as a way of gauging whether a person is ambitious or not so ambitious, or whatever it is that they. I mean, if they ask for it, you're going to have to do it. I hope to God I'm never asked, because my writing is appalling. Even I can't read it.
Sorry.
I mean, to the point I write in capitals, because I literally yeah, I type all the time, so I have no muscles for writing with a pen anymore. But I mean, if they ask for it, it's part of the process. So you do need to do it. Now, outside that, I wouldn't in any normal application process. No, I wouldn't do it. Now, if it's something very particular, I can imagine that you would be writing to the owner of the company, for example, that you might be applying to, and actually making it really personal, provided, of course, you've got really good handwriting, which a lot of people don't. It actually could be very original to do a handwritten letter in the old-fashioned style, especially if they're of an older generation. They would really appreciate it. But generally speaking, no, I think it's not so recommended. I mean, I think what is really important is so it's a well-written document, because it's about you. It's how you express yourself, whether you have good communication skills, whether you know how to, you know, reduce a lot of information into something which is concise and to the point and clear. So I think, you know, something well-written, typewritten, will do the job without necessarily having to do a handwritten thing. So finally, the do's and don'ts. So how do you stand out? Well, by customizing. I think, you know, people that really address what the organization is looking for this particular role are set out 100%, because an amazing amount of candidates don't do this. As I say, they tend to spend an awful lot of time really crafting a motivation letter, and then they send the same one to all the organizations, regardless of whether they're looking for this or that. And I think that's a lost opportunity. So a way of standing out is, customize it. Then this idea of keeping it short, so 1 page. I remember visiting the recruiter for Amgen, which at the time was the largest biotech company, and I asked her, what do you look for in a cover letter? And immediately she said, keep it short. So because they really don't have that much time to go through this enormous amount of information. So they like, things that are to the point and short, and for the same reason, keeping it simple. And then it depends where you're applying. I mean, at UNHCR, we know we have people from different nationalities. English might not be their mother tongue. So, there's a certain flexibility in a certain level of grammatical errors, etc. But don't push it too hard, because I'm thinking of particularly one of my clients, and who says that she's got great drafting skills, and motivation letters are full of very basic grammatical and spelling mistakes. So it is part of your image, how much effort are you to just put a spell check through your document, or a grammatical check, or get somebody, a colleague, to help you and just say, look, can you just help me to make this perfect? No? And then don't repeat what's already on your CV. As I mentioned, your CV is already there, so why waste the space? And I think somebody asked a question that I actually thought, this idea of focusing on a weakness, that you've changed different things. Always focus your motivation letter on why you fit, not why you don't. So this is especially a message for those that are looking to apply to roles that they haven't done before, that I've seen literally motivation saying, look, I know that I don't have the experience, but, why highlight the fact that you don't have the experience? Always focus it on the positive. I mean, they're going to see that maybe you don't have the background, but don't, why highlight it? It's best not to highlight it by mentioning it. And then, yes, don't sign off without the closure. Again, remember, this idea of you having a nice chat with somebody and then they get up and they leave without saying goodbye. So questions?
Well, we have one question on the length of the motivation letter. And Mario in particular is saying, can I use 2 pages to write my motivation letter? And if not, why not?
Okay, I mean, ideally what is recommended 1 page, and why not? I think for 2 primary reasons. Some of the recruiters that I've spoken to are looking at 450 applications a day. And, they don't have the time to read, somebody's long history. Now, of course, it depends. If you're somebody with 25 years experience, then, maybe fitting everything that you want to say in 1 page is a bit of a challenge. But I mean, most people should be able to say the key things. Because again, this is management of information. This is not about telling everything. It's about telling them enough to get you to the next stage. And the interview process in most organizations, you go through at least 2 interviews for higher positions. You might even go through 3 interviews, etc. So this is just a tool that is being used to filter candidates down to who's going to be on the interview list. So that's where you can really sit down and explain every aspect of your background, etc. But in text, no, because, again, they're gauging whether you're somebody that's capable of expressing very difficult things in a concise and clear way. So people that tend to have longer cover motivation letters tend to ramble on, and that's what the person reading them. I mean, I would invite you to, in your office, if they're ever going through a recruitment process, volunteer and say, look, I'd just like to understand how this works, and do it yourself. Just in a single afternoon, you need to read the motivation letters of 25 candidates. And very rapidly, in fact, in workshops, that's what I do. I get everybody in the workshop to bring in a motivation letter. I get them to read all the motivation letters of all the people that are there. And very quickly you realize, wow, what it is to read this stuff. So short is best.
We have a number of other questions coming in. So one about when you're actually asked to write down a weakness, how would you deal with that? And then in terms of the start of the motivation letter, when we're looking down at the competencies, will we start with the most recent experience or follow the chronological order of your life, or what would you recommend? And then I have a bunch of others.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in terms of, to be honest, I've never seen an application system that specifically requests a weakness. It's definitely something that is asked in some way in interviews, but in an application process of actually stating in writing what are your weaknesses, I haven't really seen that. Now, if you have that, I mean, as I say, I'm surprised by the question because I haven't seen it. But if you, I mean, the key thing is that they're not particularly interested in your weakness. What they're interested in is to try and get an understanding of your level of self-awareness. Because if you're self-aware, you're doing something about it. So the key thing, I would say three things. One is not to choose a weakness which is directly relevant to what you're applying to. So for example, somebody who's, if it's a data management position which requires somebody to be extremely meticulous, then, you know, stating that you're not meticulous or thorough or whatever is a weakness that is too big for, so always choose something which has nothing to do with the position. The second thing is whatever it is that you state, always accompany it by what you're doing about it. So for example, I tend to be very big picture, so which also means that I don't necessarily pay that much attention to detail. You know, I've realized that detail is extremely important, and data drives decisions. So I've learned to be much more data-driven and detail-oriented. So I'm stating a weakness, but at the same time, I'm also stating what I've been doing about it. So I would say that that's the most important thing. If you ever are confronted with a situation in which you have to explain a weakness, choose something which is not relevant to the position, and then choose something which is that is always backed up by what you're doing about it. And then there was a third aspect that I wanted to talk about that's just slipped out of my mind, but it will come back, about weaknesses. Yeah, I think, you know, what's really nice in candidates, and this is in the motivation letter and then in the interview, much more difficult to do on a CV, is people that show personality. So people, when we're talking about self-awareness, people that are aware of the fact that when they're under a lot of stress, they might become very demanding of other people, for example, or whatever. You know, you think, okay, I'm talking about this and this could really knock me out of the process. On the contrary, it's such a delight to have people that are self-aware. You know, the people that worry us as recruiters are the people that have no self-awareness, because you think, you know, especially when, you know, in interviews, you know, what could you have learned? Nothing. You know, I was perfect at it. You think, oh, I'm sure you could have learned something. You know, maybe, I don't know, time management or better communication, etc. So don't be afraid to talk about weaknesses, because, but as I say, don't talk about a weakness that is essential to the post, because, you know, it's well, maybe you shouldn't be applying to that post if it's so essential.
And the other one was about the chronological order of the I don't know, the SARC, let's say, or the proven experience or the evidence of the requirements.
Yeah, I mean, the SAR framework, if I've understood the question, no, it's in what order should you use situation, action, result, or result, action, situation?
Yes, but is more linked to the time. So should we start with the latest experience or the previous experience, or what time-wise, which one, which experience would be the most relevant, I assume?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's always a judgment call. I mean, you know, generally speaking, as I mentioned, it's better to use your latest experience, because it's what you've done right now is accumulation of everything that you might have done in the past. Now that said, maybe you've got a very powerful example from a year ago, which is much more, or 2 years ago, if you like, rather than something that's happened to you this year, which really conveys the fact that you have this skill. So because that, I mean, I'm just thinking of particular project that I worked on before coming to UNHCR, which would really express a certain competency much better than anything that I've done in the last couple of years. So I think I would still probably use that example rather than something that's happened more recently. But generally speaking, I'd be wary of choosing examples that are too far behind. I mean, ideally, as I say, what recruiters are most interested in is what are you doing now, and then let's work backwards from that, not necessarily what you did at the beginning. So it's important to try, go in reverse order, if you like.
Thank you. Now, from Josephine, can you abbreviate project names or organization you worked for if they have very long names, as long as the abbreviations are referenced in your CV, or should you at least spell them out fully once? So that's one question.
I mean, generally speaking, especially in the UN system, I remember one speaker calling it the letter soup. You know, those little soup that always have this pasta in the shape of different letters.
Okay, alphabet
soup. Alphabet soup, exactly. Because I mean, the number of everything is reduced to acronyms, no? Which and the thing is, it's something that we might be very familiar internally, but actually, even within the UN system, they mean different things in different places. CBI is cash-based interventions, is competency-based interviewing. I had another definition the other day. It's like, oh, wait a minute, that's a new one. So I think it's better to specify these things because often we ourselves are not even sure what they are. Now, if it's a UN organization, I mean, we all know WFP, we all know UNESCO, we all know, UNICEF. So you don't need to write these out. But especially when it comes to specific things within a job role, for example, I think, be careful with that because, as I say, different things mean in different organizations. And I think it's better. I mean, you don't need to mention it every time. Maybe the first time, for example, career management officer, first time you say career management officer, but then I could say as a CMO in the next, in brackets CMO, and then the next time I just CMO rather than mentioning the whole thing again. But yeah, I'd be careful with that.
Thank you. And Brian is then asking to perhaps talk a little bit more in detail about why not elaborate on the lines of your CV in your cover letter, how they tie to certain skills and competences. So we touched upon it briefly, but again, kind of perhaps reinforcing the message.
So why not repeat what's on your CV?
Why not elaborate? So why not talk more about some of the lines of your CV and tie them with the skills and competences?
I think you should. The thing is that you can't do it for everything. So you're going to have to choose which of those things you're going to elaborate on based on, having looked at the full job description and operational context as it exists, and chosen, okay, what is most important for that role. So I'm going to elaborate on, 3 things on my CV because you don't have the space to elaborate on everything that's there. It's impossible. If you want to be, clear to the point, again, aperitif rather than giving the full meal in there, you can't, if you look at it from a reader's perspective, you can't overwhelm them with too much information. You need to keep things, I know it's counterintuitive, but keeping things simple is actually more effective.
Thank you. Very simple one. Do I need to sign the letter or just type the name?
I prefer signed letters. If it's something that you have to then convert to a PDF, etc., I prefer signed letters because it, again, makes it much more personal, makes it more look like a letter. Now, if you're uploading, if you're doing a copy paste into the system, clearly that's not necessary. But yeah, no, I guess I still belong to that generation in which I think signed letters look more like a letter than something that's just simply a text.
Okay, so one kind of comment with a question inside, saying from Roshan, saying sometimes I apply to companies I know nothing about and I'm invited for interview. However, sometimes I apply to the organization company that I know best and the position, and I know well the position also I'm applying for, but I'm not interviewed. Why?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I didn't understand it.
Yeah, so the question is essentially saying sometimes I apply to kind of random companies that I know nothing about and have no connection to, and I pass the first stage and I get called for an interview. Whilst in other instances, working, for example, for the same company or in the same area, in an organization that I know well, I don't get called for interviews. Why could that be?
Yeah, I mean the whole selection process is it is a mystery. I mean, sometimes you feel as if it's a Greek tragedy, where you have these people either sending you blessings or sending you thunderbolts. I mean, maybe you wrote to these companies randomly, and well, I mean, two things could happen. Nobody's applied, and so they'll call everybody that's applied, which hopefully is not the case. Or they actually really liked what you wrote, and so that's good enough for them, and that's why you're being called. No, whereas maybe the companies, the organizations that you're really interested in, have been flooded by hundreds of applications, and maybe it's not what you've written is not so relevant to what they're looking for. So that could be it as well. I mean, the whole process around recruitment is, as I say, it's a bit of a mystery how things happen. One would hope that it's 100% scientific and process driven, but often it isn't. It might be that they had 60 applicants, of which you might be an internal, but they've got another 40 that are internal too, and 5 of them have 2 more years experience than you do, and then that's what they've decided is going to be the filter. So it's kind of very, very difficult to really understand why in some cases you're amazed that, oh my God, I've been called and actually I didn't even make much of an effort, and then in other cases when you really did make the effort, nothing seems to happen. It's very frustrating. I mean, I always think that this whole process, the only way of addressing it psychologically is to do things which are very targeted, do them well, but don't expect anything. Because if you do, it's a recipe in frustration. The analogy that I always draw is what racehorses do. They have their blinkers on and they keep on running until they get past the post and they're told to stop. And with applications, you little bit need to do the same thing, because if not, it can be really frustrating. That you're banking all your hopes and dreams on a particular thing that you've applied to, and then nothing happens. It's very, very frustrating. But if you know that it's part of this greater process, and eventually you're getting the job that you want, then it becomes less psychologically wearing. I think it's the only thing that I would advise. But it's a bit of a mystery.
Thank you. There is one more question on the expected salary. How to answer that question? Sometimes companies ask, please specify your expected salary for the position.
I mean, my guru, Daniel, always used to laugh, because if they ever ask you about this in an interview, just say, oh, so you're offering me the job? No, we're not offering the job. It's a very difficult one to answer. I would say 2 things. One is, ideally, a way of avoiding the question is to say, look, once we've really understood what the responsibilities are going to be, because often organizations change the TORs depending on what candidate they have. Once we've established that, then we can start talking salary, because the responsibilities will talk for themselves in terms of what I should be paid. So that's one area of recommendation. It works better in the private sector, where there's more flexibility. I mean, in the UN system, you're graded, and then your salary is based on your grade and the step in your grade. In the outside world, large organizations have bandwidth. So if you're at level A, it's between this and this. If you're at level B, it's between this and this. And depending on how much experience and your negotiation skills, you're either at the lower end of the bandwidth or at the top of the bandwidth. Another way to address it is, if you know what these bandwidths might be, just go for the top of that bandwidth, because it's been proven that people that negotiate get better salaries than people that don't. So, but you need to know what that value of that job is in that market, and the only way of knowing that, well, certainly private sector companies are very secretive about it, but it's trying to find out with people that are working in the organization, because then it would give you an understanding of what you might be paid for that role.
Thank you. And one more. I think the other ones have more or less been covered. Please write it down again if you feel that your question has not been addressed. But one last question about self-motivated application, which means essentially knocking door to door to a specific project or a program within UN organizations with your CV. So going in and saying, "Hi, Rosie, I would be interested in working with you, even though you may not have a job application." What about that?
Well, I think it can only be effective when you really know what, for the sake of argument, I'm the manager, what's keeping me awake at night. I mean, I had a student client that was fantastic at this, and she graduated in 2010, which was a year after the financial crisis, and managed to amass 7 different job offers. So I asked, how do you do this? And then she said, well, no, a lot of cold calling. I mean, she was going for jobs. She was specialized in renewable energy investment in Africa. And so she was looking for all the different companies that were working in investing in renewable energy projects in Africa, and she would cold call them. And she told me that she wouldn't get 100% return, but she would get 50% return of people saying, well, at the very least, I'd like to meet you. And what she would do was to research the company, what they were doing in terms of investing in renewable energy in Africa, and then she also knew what the challenges that a lot of these companies suffer from. So it might be regulation or bureaucracy, blah blah blah. And so I mean, she showed me her motivation letters. I mean, they literally would go for the challenge. Companies investing in renewable energy projects in Africa normally suffer from blah blah blah, and so that would immediately make them stand up. Of you know what my problems are, and then she would basically follow it up with, this is how I can help you with that. And so that was much more effective than and she told me that actually the people that would ring her up would say, wow, we're getting these letters all the time, but we're giving you a call specifically because you've really understood what we're suffering. So as I say, at the very least, I'm going to give you an interview. So if you make that first paragraph about them, but to do that, you really need to know, okay, what is keeping Rosie awake at night? Is it this or is it that? And go for that challenge, and then show them how you can help them resolve that challenge.
And do you think this is applicable to the UN system as well?
Well, I think I mean, certainly not for general positions. I mean, the positions that don't exist, put it that way. I mean, maybe the odd time a manager will say, oh, actually, that's, fantastic. And then I am thinking of putting something up because I need a project or I need and then telling the person, hey, by the way, thank you very much. In the next 6 months, we're going to be posting a consulting project for this specific challenge. Maybe that could happen. I mean, it's a little bit less likely, I would say. But again, I mean, I've seen managers here at UNHCR that are more open, and some that is like, what the hell? Totally. It depends on the person. Some people are very receptive and they think, okay, that's kind of really interesting, and then they could sort of basically develop a relationship, saying, look, thank you so much for this. We will be looking for people in my unit section, whatever, in the near future. Keep a lookout on the career site, because I mean, everything needs to be posted through the UN system. It has to be a fair, transparent process. But at the very least, you've already caught their attention. So that's at least one advantage.
Thank you. We actually have only one question on which actually touches upon last month's conversation that we had on the photograph on the CV, whether you would recommend it or not.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. It's an interesting thing, the photograph thing. I think it depends very much on where you're applying. The Anglo-Saxon world, so we're talking US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, don't encourage photographs. And in fact, I think in the US it's against the law. But it's interesting because LinkedIn is an American company, and everybody has their picture on LinkedIn. So the culture is changing, but they don't like it because they feel that it's what do you call it, it could be a motive for discrimination. And the moment that people see your photograph, they start making automatic assumptions about you. And in fact, I have somewhere a study that I saw that was mentioned in The Economist, that it's actually to your advantage if you're a male and you're very good looking, and it's to your disadvantage if you're a female. So that already shows the bias that, you know, a good looking female must necessarily be stupid and a good looking male is macho or something. You know, so the biases that exist with the system. So in the Anglo-Saxon world, it's not encouraged at all. But as I say, LinkedIn is really breaking with all of this, and you know, people that you would never expect to have photographs on their LinkedIn profile. You know, we're talking about very well-known people have it. So things are changing. In some countries like Germany, it's absolutely essential to have it, and in fact, you know, they invest. A lot of candidates invest a lot of money going to official photographers to get a proper, and you see that in German candidates always have great photographs in getting, you know, very good professional photographs made. In the Latin world, so you know, Spain, Latin America, etc. Again, it's quite acceptable to have your photograph there. And in fact, I was doing some research on LinkedIn for a session on how to build your LinkedIn profile, and I was horrified to see, you know, in one particular country, you know, people on the beach in their LinkedIn profile, and it's meant to be professional. So, so certainly there are no qualms about putting your photograph there at all. But I mean, whatever you choose, it should be very much, you know, a headshot with a light background so they can see your face. So these pictures that you often see, I mean, it's not Facebook, you know, it's a CV and it's LinkedIn. So it needs to be something that shows who you are without necessarily. I mean, you see some pictures that you really feel actually, you know, this is for social media, your personal life, not for a professional setting.
Thanks, Rosie. So are you telling me I need to remove my picture in bikini from LinkedIn? Joking. You haven't met me, but joking, definitely joking. As a recruiter, would you be more appealed by passion, interest-driven motivation letter, which shows the personality of the applicant, or rather quality, capacity-driven motivation letters? So it's more about the passion, or it's more about the competence, or a mix of the two?
I mean, generally speaking, I would say it's a mix. Depending on the organization, one or the other can be more important. I mean, generally speaking, for example, the humanitarian world, we're a very technical world. So, you know, passion, yes, that's great, but we don't want people with lighters, you know, save the world, but then with no skills, because, you know, we are delivering very technical things to people that need our services. So I think now that said, one of the interns in Geneva, she asked me again to review her motivation letter, etc. And I saw the position that I had to review the motivation letter for, and I mean, you could see that there they were looking for fit with personality. You know, they were talking about how they wanted people with a sense of humor, that were able to cope under stress. So there, the motivation letter clearly was much more personal, and you know, they were asking for a particular experience as well. So it's not that they're going to hire you purely on the fact that you have a good sense of humor, but that was, you could see it was really important to them. So yeah, I would say the job description will already give you a good idea of, you know, what is more important. I mean, UNHCR, when I applied, it would have been 3 years ago. I was surprised that it was never even asked in the interview. You know, that they were very, very focused on whether I had the skills and knowledge to do the job that I do. And I would have thought, actually, you know, given we're a mission-driven organization, there would have been at least one question of, you know, why are you applying, and not at all. It was purely competency-based. I think that the job description should already give you an indication to what extent you should balance these two items. I think they're both important, but where the greater emphasis is, you can kind of tell a little bit by the organization's culture.
We have also another question, since we started talking about LinkedIn. I think Brian got curious. Do you think employers generally use LinkedIn to make hiring or rejection decision, or we're still really working on CV based?
I mean, it depends what sector you're talking about. I mean, I was reading some statistics last week, I think it was, that 97% of recruiters in the Western world are now using LinkedIn to search candidates, which is, you know, huge, huge. So it's becoming much more and more important. Now, often I think when they're talking about using LinkedIn, they're probably using LinkedIn to advertise their roles, not necessarily to do the whole recruitment system that like UNHCR, we post a lot on LinkedIn, but then the application process is still going through our application system. In the UN system, generally, I would say it's the same thing. You're still going through Inspira or, you know, whatever system that particular agency has. But it is true that this is the world that we're moving towards. You know, the UN system a lot more slowly than the private sector, but it is becoming more and more important. For being found, because recruiters are looking for people with using these keywords, etc. But also because increasingly maybe the application will be through LinkedIn.
I don't think there are any more questions. I'm going to give you probably a couple of minutes just to see if there is any other burning question on motivation letters. I remind you that all the recordings and the presentation plus the materials and resources that Rosie shares during our presentations are available on the learning platform on the UNB campus under the career transition webinars section. So you will find it quite easily there with all the materials. Perhaps some reflections from me. One of the things I'm going to take away from today's session is about motivation letter is don't confuse the means with the end. So really kind of make yourself stand out, not simply by stating some facts that are already present maybe in the CV, but highlighting those elements of why you're applying and why you and why this particular job or organization. Also, importantly, kind of realizing that what recruiters are looking for are the top talents, which have the two things, the drive and the skills. So when drafting a motivation letter, I think the drive, the passion really needs to also come through, which wouldn't necessarily come out of a regular CV, of a standard CV, which is quite straightforward. So perhaps these are my takeaway for today. There is no other questions here. I don't know, Rosie, if you have a final thought for the colleagues.
No, I think, I mean, basically, once you've understood the structure, you know, look at the position, work out your 3 key things you want to say, work out how you're going to support them, and then start writing. And then you'll be absolutely fine. Well, writing, you know, the perfect motivation letter. Perfect. Thank you so much to everyone for being here with us. As we said, we have another session on for the career transition, which will look at interviewing skills. And that would be the last of our 5 session career transition online learning series. Thank you to your participants. Thank you so much, Rosie, for being, as usual, an incredible source of information and interesting facts, as well as some really hard to grasp sometimes concept and processes. I think it's really helpful helps us also understand what is behind the recruitment process on one side, but also how to present the CVs and ourselves better into the labor market. So thank you again, and until the next time. Okay, you're very welcome, and have a nice evening, everybody, or day, wherever you are. Thank you.